They locked the doors not to keep evil out, but to keep something within. When midnight struck, prayers turned to silence. The parish was never opened again, and those who entered after swore it was still full of voices. Under a pale, rolling sky, the parish rises slowly into view. Its steeple seems taller than the trees around it. The stone is weathered, the roof line uneven, but the bells above still linger in memory. It stands on a hill isolated from the villages below. Not far, but far enough to feel apart. The kind of distance where a silence gathers, where you can see the parish in daylight, yet feel its shadow at dusk. They said it was old, older than records made clear, and they said its people were different. The villagers still remember the sound of the bells, not just on Sunday mornings, not only at funerals or weddings, but sometimes, without reason, the bells would ring, and they rang longer, harder, echoing across the hillsides, as though announcing something no one else could hear. Farmers in their fields would stop and listen. Mothers would hush their children. Even the cattle grew restless when the sound drifted over the grass. At first, it was only curiosity. The parish was devout, they said, more serious than most. Its priests held older ways, its people bound by rituals that few outsiders understood. But the bells told a different story, a story that could not be written down. There are records, yes, scattered through county archives and brittle parish logs, names of priests, dates of feasts, lists of births and deaths. But what survives is fragmentary, whole pages missing, ink smudged beyond recognition, and in the margins, faint annotations in Latin, notes that seem less like clerical reminders and more like warnings. It is the oral history that carries the weight, the whispers of those who live below the hill. Men and women now old recall what they saw as children, the long walks up the path, the smell of incense that hung even beyond the doors, the faces of parishioners, blank, watchful, too still. One man remembered how, on the eve of winter, the bells rang for nearly an hour. No feast, no funeral, just sound, relentless, metallic, filling the valley until the air itself seemed to tighten. But something wasn't right. When the bells stopped, he said, the silence that followed was worse. A silence you could feel in your chest, like a pressure, like the whole hill was holding its breath. The parish had been built, they said, by men who came from elsewhere, foreign stonemasons, working under direction of a priest whose name survives only faintly. Father Aurelius. No one knew where he had come from. No one knew why he chose this hill. The building was not grand, but heavy, walls thick, windows narrow, its doors sealed tight with iron fittings, older than any in the villages below. The altar stood not at the center, but at the farthest end, shadowed, half hidden, and there were rituals, not strange enough to call heresy, but different. The order of prayers, the length of fasts, the way parishioners would bow in unison, not toward the cross, but toward the bell tower. Children noticed first. They told stories of shapes seen in the windows at night, figures standing still when no one should be inside, shadows that moved when no torch was lit. Parents hushed them, but the whispers spread, and the hill became something to be avoided after dark. Records show that attendance there grew smaller over time, not because of scandal, not because of neglect, but because something in the air was different, tight, heavy, almost oppressive. Yet still the parish lived, through war, through famine, through plague, always ringing its bells longer than any other church. And that's when they began to wonder, what called them to keep ringing? What compelled those priests to cling to rituals others had abandoned? And why, when outsiders asked, did parishioners never answer directly? The old priest in the village below once admitted, in a letter preserved only by chance, that he feared what was happening on that hill. He wrote of faces pale as ash, eyes that did not meet his, and voices that prayed not for forgiveness, but for endurance. No one knew what that meant, but by the time the letter was found, the parish had already changed. No longer was it simply a place of worship. It had become a presence, a weight above the valley. And when the bells rang, men swore they felt in their bones. The parish on the hill remained, its doors closed, its windows dark, but its sound carried. And the villagers knew, though they could not say why, that whatever faith was practiced there, it was not meant for them. The records fade. The oral histories grow thin. But the memory lingers, a parish apart, a hill that does not welcome, and always the bells, ringing longer, deeper, until the night itself seemed to listen. That was the parish on the hill, and it was only the beginning. The camera drifts slowly down the aisle, pews worn smooth by hands, shadows press into grain of the wood. At the far end, the altar glimmers faintly, and behind it, a figure stands. Father Maverick. His name appears again and again in the surviving ledgers. A priest whose tenure lasted longer than most, whose presence, by all accounts, was steady, but whose words, preserved in diaries and notes, reveal something far less ordinary. The villagers below remembered his voice. Measured, calm, a voice that carried more weight than the bells themselves. They said his sermons were unlike the others they had heard. Not fiery, not pleading, but slow, careful, as though he were unveiling something only he fully understood. And what he promised was strange. He told his parishioners that judgment would come, that the world beyond the hill was already trembling under its weight. But here, within these walls, there was safety, not through confession, not through the sacraments, but through silence, through what he called the sealing. It was a phrase he repeated, in sermons, in diaries, in the faint handwriting left in margins. The midnight sealing preserves the flock. What it meant was never explained outright, but there are hints, descriptions of doors, of locks fastened from within, of candles extinguished at once, leaving only the echo of the bells. And then nothing. One entry describes a parish gathered in silence, waiting, breath shallow, no sound but the wind at the shutters. The words written in Malrich's hand. They shall be preserved through stillness, for silence speaks where prayer cannot. At first, the villagers dismissed it as metaphor. Priests often turned to strange phrasing. But over time, unease grew, because Father Malrich's flock began to change. They avoided conversation with outsiders. They walked the lanes quietly, heads low, lips sealed. Children were taught not to sing, not to cry out, not even to laugh too loudly. Silence became not only custom, but law, and all the while Malrich promised safety, that those who obeyed would be spared what was to come. But something wasn't right. Survivors, those who left the parish early, recalled the sermons differently. They remembered not only the words, but the pauses, how Malrich would stop speaking for long stretches, standing before the altar in stillness, eyes fixed somewhere far away. Minutes passed like that, and when he finally spoke again, his voice seemed lower, almost strained. One woman swore she heard him repeat a phrase 3 times. The lock must hold. The lock must hold. The lock must hold. What door he was speaking of, no one knew. The church itself bore changes. Doors reinforced. Latches added. Even the sacristy fitted with bolts that seemed unnecessary. Visitors noticed keys on Father Malrich's belt. Not 1, not 2, but a ring of them. Keys that jingled when he walked. Keys he never allowed out of sight. Diaries recovered after the parish was abandoned mention them too. One entry, scrawled in fading ink. Each lock is a prayer. Each seal a covenant. Without them, the silence will be broken. And what happens if the silence breaks? The pages give no answer. Those who attended his sermons spoke of the way he lingered on judgment, not as a distant warning, but as an imminent arrival, something already approaching, something pressing close. And he assured them only one thing could withstand it, the sealing, and that's when he heard it. One former parishioner, long since moved away, described a moment he realized he could not stay. It was during the Feast of All Saints. The bells had rung at dusk, the pews were full, and Malrich preached on the promise of preservation. He spoke of the doors, the locks, the need to remain within. Then he paused. The man recalled a long silence, longer than usual, long enough that the congregation grew restless. And in that silence, he swore he heard the faint sound of another lock turning, not in the church, not in sight, but deeper, somewhere behind the walls. He left the parish soon after, and he never returned. The diaries confirm only fragments. Notes about salvation through silence. Sketches of doorways drawn in margins. A line underlined twice. No cry must escape. And Malric himself. He does not appear in records after a certain point. His name fades. No death recorded. No transfer noted. Only absence. The parishioners who remained clung tighter to the ceiling. Nights grew quieter. Windows shuttered earlier. The bells rang longer. But the promises grew darker. Malric had once spoken of safety. Now, according to the surviving accounts, he spoke of endurance, of lasting not against time, but against intrusion, as if something pressed closer each passing night. The locks multiplied, the silence deepened, and the hill grew more withdrawn from the world below. The villagers came to avoid it altogether. Some claimed that when the wind carried the bells, it also carried another sound, not words, not chants, but the faint pressure of silence itself. Heavy, unnatural, oppressive. The parish was sealed, yes, but sealed against what? No answer survives. Only the words of Malric, scattered and incomplete. The sealing must remain unbroken, for in the silence, salvation rests. And if the silence is lost, so too are we. The parish remain on the hill, the doors fastened, the windows dark, the bells tolling at midnight. And beneath it all, a promise whispered through the years. That judgment was near, that silence was safety, that locks were prayers, and that Father Malric had already heard what was coming. Tall grass bends in the wind. Stone markers lean, their names eroded, half lost. At the top of the hill, the steps climb toward the parish doors. But the yard is empty. No children play here anymore. No games of chase among the gravestones. No laughter breaking the stillness. It wasn't always like this. For generations, the churchyard had been a gathering place. Children would climb the stones, weaving between the graves, daring one another to touch the iron handles of the church doors. The sound of bells was not frightening then. It was part of life. But something changed. The first stories came from the children themselves. They spoke of hearing sounds during the day. Not the bells, not hymns, but something else. Muffled cries, thin, desperate, carried just faintly through the heavy wooden doors, even during Mass, even as the congregation sat inside, listening to Father Malric. One boy whispered that he heard a woman calling. Another swore he heard a pounding, as though fists struck from the other side. Parents dismissed it at first. Imagination, they said. Children make stories of shadows. But the children stopped playing there, one by one, and soon the yard was silent. But something wasn't right. Farmers began noticing their animals would not climb the steps. Oxen balked at the incline. Horses refused to be led near the stones. Even dogs, usually eager to follow their masters anywhere, froze at the base of the hill, growling low, ears pinned back, refusing to advance. Accounts preserved in letters speak of this change. One man wrote, "The cattle will not go. They stiffen as if against a blow. The dogs whine, turn back. They sense something in the stones." And soon, it was not only animals that avoided the parish. Villagers themselves began to step aside. Where once paths crossed easily beneath the hill, people now took longer routes. Better to lose an hour's time than pass too near those doors. The change was quiet at first, subtle, but over months, the unease became undeniable. A woman told of hearing it herself. She had lingered outside the church one afternoon, waiting for her husband. The bells had rung. The sermon was underway. And then, faintly from behind the thick wooden doors, she swore she heard sobbing. Not loud, not clear, but unmistakable. And that's when she heard it. The sound rose just enough to pierce the chanting from within. Not words, but a plea. A voice pressed low, as though buried under stone. She left before the sermon ended, and she never set foot inside again. Others followed, not suddenly, not in panic, but steadily, one family after another. deciding it was better to worship in smaller chapels down the valley, better to attend Mass in barns, or in secret, than to risk the silence of the parish hill. And so, the pews began to empty. The diaries from this time note the change. Father Malrick wrote of those who departed, his words calm, but edged with something else. They leave, for they do not understand the silence. Yet silence will preserve, even against their cries. The cries, always the cries. Some claimed to hear them at night as well. Passing the hill on late walks, they said muffled voices drifted through the shutters, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, always distant, as though trapped. No one ever saw who made the sounds. The doors remained fastened, the windows dark, but the hill no longer belonged to the living. It had become something to avoid, a place spoken of in lowered voices. One account tells of a boy who tried to prove his courage. He boasted he would run to the top, touch the iron door, and return. But when he reached the first step, he froze. He said he felt a pressure, as though the air itself thickened. And in that pressure, he heard it, a faint cry, deep and muffled, closer than it should have been. He turned back, and he would not speak of it again. But something wasn't right. The parish, once the heart of the valley, was now the center of unease, and the first omens were unmistakable. Children would not play there. Animals would not climb the steps. Families began to leave, not in anger, not in open rebellion, but quietly, carrying only what they could, choosing distance over silence. By the end of that year, the churchyard stood deserted. Grass overgrew the stones. The laughter of children was gone, and the bells, when they rang only for those still sealed inside. The hill stood apart, marked now by absence, surrounded by whispers, and everyone knew whatever was crying behind those doors was not meant to be heard. Snow drifts across the hillside. The parish stands dark, its steeple cutting a sharp line against the pale sky. No light flickers in the windows. No warmth escapes from the doors. It is the night before midnight. The villagers below remembered it. They said it was unlike any night before, as if the hill itself had drawn in its breath. By dusk, every window had been shuttered. The candles, one seen glowing faintly through glass, were extinguished. No hymn was sung. No bell was rung. Instead, there was only movement. Witnesses described the parishioners climbing the hill in silence, one after another, families walking together, carrying baskets of food, jars of water, bedding rolled tightly under their arms. Children were hushed. No voices rose, only the crunch of boots on frozen earth, the creak of wood under weight, and all of them moved toward the church. But something wasn't right. They were not dressed for Mass. There were no candles in their hands, no prayer books. Instead, their arms were full with provisions, the kind not for a service, but for a stay. From the fields below, farmers paused in their work to watch. Some leaned against their tools, staring in silence as the long procession continued. Others closed their shutters, not wishing to see. One man later confessed that he counted them. Dozens, he said, every member of the parish, filing in as though summoned, and not one of them looked back. The doors opened slowly, heavy iron hinges groaning against the cold. The parishioners entered, and the doors closed again. No one saw them leave. Letters written weeks later described the unease that followed. One villager noted, it was not a Mass they prepared for, but something else, something in silence. They carried bread and bedding, as though to remain inside. And remain they did. The following morning, the hill was still. No smoke rose from chimneys. No voices carried on the air. The door stayed shut. The shutters stayed sealed. The bells did not toll. And that's when he heard it. A boy sent to fetch water near the base of the hill claimed he heard faint sounds carried by the wind. Not cries, not hymns, but the dragging of wood across stone, as though benches or pews were being pulled into place, as though the parish was fortifying itself from within. When he told his father, he was silenced at once. No one wanted to hear, no one wanted to know, but the stories spread anyway. Some said they saw shadows moving behind the shutters at night, flickers of shapes against faint candlelight, though no flame was ever visible from outside. Others swore they heard voices, not in song, but in whispered prayer, dozens of voices, rising and falling together, then cutting short all at once. By the third day, animals refused even the slope below the church. Horses strained against reins. Cattle turned away. Even dogs howled if led too near the stone steps. The villagers began to keep their distance too. It was not fear in the usual sense. It was something deeper, something like shame, as though to look upon the parish was to witness something they were not meant to see. And yet, none could forget the sight of that night. The procession of neighbors, friends, kin, carrying with them not the trappings of worship, but the necessities of survival, food, water, bedding, and none returning. The church stood silent through the winter. Snow covered the steps, untouched. No footprints marked the hill. The valley below grew restless. Whispers filled the taverns and market stalls, the small chapels where the others now prayed. Some believed the parish had sealed itself away from the world. Others feared something within had demanded it. The records from that season are thin. But one diary entry survives, written in a trembling hand. The hill is dark. They are gone inside. I do not think we will see them again. The hill became a void, a silence above the valley, and the villagers could only watch, waiting, never knowing what was unfolding beyond those locked doors. The night before midnight marked the last time the parish was seen alive. What happened after would never be spoken of the same way twice. The camera drifts across a black sky. No stars, no moon, only a low ceiling of winter clouds pressing down on the parish. Snow had stopped falling hours before, but the air still carried that heavy, muffled weight, like a blanket thrown over the earth. Every sound seemed dampened. Every breath hung visible in the dark. And in the center of that silence, the parish church stood, its spire lifted into the night, like a finger pointing at heaven, but its windows were shuttered, its doors bolted from within. Its stone face was as black as the sky above it. The village had never looked so empty, but inside they waited. The day had passed like no other. The parishioners had carried their bedding, their food, their children into the nave. They had whispered prayers. They had stacked their provisions against the walls. They believed the world outside was about to be judged, and only those who sealed themselves at midnight would be preserved. At first, neighbors laughed. Farmers at the edge of the square shook their heads at the sight of entire families vanishing into the church. But as dusk fell, fewer voices carried across the cobbles. By nightfall, not a lamp remained burning in any house. The square had fallen dark, and then the doors shut. They closed them from within. A groan of old timber, the metallic scrape of bolts, the echo of iron sliding into place. Witnesses swore they saw hands pulling the crossbar across. One by one, the windows were latched and boarded, the shutters hammered shut until no candlelight leaked through. Not even the faintest glow escaped into the square. The building looked abandoned, but they were all inside. A few villagers had remained outside, skeptics, the doubtful, those who had chosen not to believe Father Mauer's promise of salvation. They lingered in the shadows of their cottages, staring at the silent church. Some stood with their families pressed close. Others stood alone, their arms wrapped against the cold. No one spoke. No one dared to break the stillness. And then the bells rang. They tolled at midnight, deep, rolling strikes that shook through the stone tower. Each note carried across the roofs and fields, heavy and final, like a judge's gavel falling again and again. 1, 2, 3. The villagers counted. It was not unusual for the bells to toll 12 times. The clock tower, after all, marked the hour with a solemn rhythm. But on this night, the rhythm carried something heavier. 4, 5, 6. The sound seemed slower, more drawn out. 7, 8. Some said the tones sounded wrong, as though the metal were warped. 9, 10, 11. A pause. 12. And then another. 13. Every witness agreed. The bell struck 13 times. But the parish had no 13th bell. For a moment, silence followed. The kind of silence that feels alive. that breathes against your skin. Those who stood in the square waited for another sound, for footsteps, for voices, for hymns. But no sound came. The church stood mute, its doors sealed, its tower dark. Inside, not a whisper escaped. Some villagers swore they felt the air change, a sudden stillness, as though even the wind had died. Dogs, restless at the edge of the square, dropped to their bellies and whined. Horses shifted uneasily in their stables. Even the livestock in their pens pressed against the far corners as though pushing away from something unseen. The entire village seemed to recoil. And then nothing. The night stretched on. Those who lingered outside grew cold. Some returned to their homes, bolting their doors behind them. Others remained at their windows, staring across the frost-glazed square, unable to turn away. But no matter how long they watched, no movement stirred. The church remained still, silent. When dawn came, it fell across an empty village. The frost glistened in the pale light. The fields sparkled with ice. The cottages stood quiet, their chimneys unlit. But the square was deserted. No villagers bustled across it. No children chased one another along the cobbles. No merchants set up their stalls. The streets were bare. Every house was vacant, and the church remained sealed. Later, survivors who returned spoke of the same sight. Doors left unlocked, beds unmade, food left sitting on wooden tables, half prepared for meals that would never be eaten. It was as though the village had emptied itself in a single breath, as though the earth had swallowed its own people. But the church still stood, its spire casting a shadow over the silent square, its doors still barred from within, and not a sound, not a single sound, escaped from inside. That morning, a traveler approached from the east road. He had set out before dawn and reached the outskirts by mid-morning. He expected to hear the chatter of a living town, the cries of market sellers, the clang of iron from the blacksmith, the tolling of a morning angelus. Instead, he found silence. The cottages were empty. The square was bare. And when he approached the church, he felt something cold move through him. He placed his hand against the heavy wood of the door. It was warm, as though pressed by countless bodies inside. But when he leaned close, listening for voices, he heard nothing. Others came in the days that followed. Merchants on their way north, shepherds leading their flocks, strangers seeking shelter. Each found the same scene, an abandoned village, a silent church, doors that would not open, and no trace of those who had once lived there. Some whispered that Father Maurik had kept his promise, that his flock had been sealed away, preserved from a judgment that would soon strike the world. Others whispered something darker, that they had sealed themselves against the world not to escape it, but to hide something within. The truth remained behind the barred doors, and the bells never tolled again. But on certain nights, when the sky is low and the air heavy, travelers swear they hear the faint echo of 13 strikes, rolling from a tower whose bell should have stopped ringing long ago, and the church still stands, waiting. The camera drifts across the square. Frost still clings to the stones. The church stands in silence, its windows sealed, its doors dark. But in the weeks that followed, people began to say they heard things. It began with the miller's wife. She lived at the edge of the stream, in the crooked house with the leaning wheel. She was a woman known for her calmness, the kind of person who never gave in to rumors, never spread gossip. One night, as she lay awake, she heard it, a sound rolling faintly through the stillness. It was not the river. It was not the wind. It was low, steady, repeating, a chant. She sat up in bed. Her husband snored beside her, his arms heavy against the quilt, but she remained alert, her ears straining in the dark. The sound rose and faded. Voices, too many to count, all speaking at once, their tones weaving together into something she could not understand. At first she thought she imagined it, but when she stepped to the window, she saw the faint outline of the church tower through fog, and the sound seemed to come from there. The next morning she told no one, not because she feared disbelief, but because she feared belief. She kept it in her chest, carrying it through her work, through the slow turning of the wheel, through the long hours of washing and needing and mending. But each night, the sound returned, faint, almost beneath hearing, a constant murmur rising from the parish. Others began to notice. The blacksmith was the second. He worked late, pounding his hammer against the iron, sparks shooting into the darkness of his forge. His was a trade of noise and fire, and yet one evening he stopped, because in the silence between blows he saw it, a flicker of light, not from his fire, but from the church. He leaned out of his doorway. The night was still, the square empty, but there, between the cracks of the boards nailed across the windows, a glow, soft, trembling, as though candles still burned inside. The light shifted, moved, danced as if carried by hands unseen. And then, just as quickly, it faded. By morning, the blacksmith told a neighbor. The neighbor told his wife. And soon the whisper spread. The parish was not empty. Something still stirred within. At first, curiosity pulled them forward. A small group gathered at dusk, standing at the base of the steps. Farmers, tradesmen, 2 children clinging to their mother's skirts. They touched the doors. The oak was cold beneath their palms. One of the men pressed his shoulder against it. Another joined him. Together they leaned, straining with their weight, their boots sliding against the stone. But the doors did not shift, not even the creak of hinges. The blacksmith tried next. He was a strong man, his arms thick from years of work, his chest broad as the bellows. He spat in his hands and gripped the iron handles. He pulled. The veins swelled in his neck. His teeth clenched, but the wood did not move. He stepped back, panting. "It's as if they'd been fused," he muttered. And no one answered. They tried with tools. An axe swung at the frame, the iron wedge driven at the seam. But the blade glanced away. The wedge splintered. The oak held firm. The blacksmith touched the crack with his fingers and swore. He felt warmth radiating from within. The crowd stepped back. The mother pulled her children away. No one wanted to be the first to say it aloud, but each one of them thought the same thing. There were people inside, and they did not want to come out. Nights grew longer. The chanting returned, carrying faintly across the frost. Some villagers claimed they heard it strongest just before dawn. Others swore it followed them through their dreams. And always, from time to time, that flicker of light, a candle passing behind boards that should have been sealed. Whispers spread of shadows at the windows, a glimpse of movement behind the tower slats. One farmer insisted he saw a hand press against the glass, just for a moment, before it slid away. No one believed him, but no one slept easily after. Weeks passed. Those who lingered by the church stopped speaking of salvation. They no longer spoke of Father Malrick's promise. Instead, they spoke only of what they thought they heard. And each time they drew close, the doors remained shut, unmoving, as if they were not doors at all, but part of the stone itself. And then, the miller's wife, the first to hear the chant, finally broke her silence. She told her sister. Her sister told her husband. And soon the truth spread. The voices were not singing hymns. They were repeating the same words, again and again. A single phrase she could not understand. Foreign, ancient, a prayer that did not belong to the church. That was when unease turned to fear, because if those sealed within were still alive, they were not praying to the God they once knew. The blacksmith would later confess that he stopped working at night. He could no longer bear to see the light flicker across the boards. He hammered only in daylight, and when the sun fell, he barred his windows, locked his door, and pretended not to hear the voices drifting through the cold. But still they came, low, steady, unbroken, like water dripping against stone. And soon the villagers stopped approaching the church altogether. They crossed the square quickly. They kept their eyes low, and the doors remained sealed, silent in the day, whispering at night, and always the weight of the same question hung in their silence. Were they listening to survivors, or to something else entirely? The camera drifts slowly across the parish square, stone worn smooth by centuries, frost still clinging to the seams between cobblestones, a silence so complete it feels less like absence and more like a weight. It had been decades since the night the church was sealed. Entire generations had grown up knowing it only as a monument to fear. Parents told their children not to stray too close. The older ones whispered stories about chanting, about footsteps inside when no one could be there. But the truth was simpler. The doors had never opened until the bishop sent his envoy. The letter arrived in early winter, an official decree stamped with red wax. The parish was to be opened, examined, and restored to the custody of the church. No explanation, no mention of what had happened there long ago, only an order. The envoy arrived with workmen, 3 wagons loaded with tools, iron bars, chains, timbers cut for leverage, and men who had broken open monasteries and vaults before, but none who wished to touch this door. The villagers stood back, watching from the edges of the square, faces pale in the cold. Some crossed themselves, some muttered prayers under their breath. One woman pressed her hands over her child's ears, as if sound itself might be dangerous. The envoy ordered the lock broken. A heavy iron device rusted across the surface, but strangely intact. No sign of rot, no sign of weathering, as if time had never touched it. The first hammer strike rang too loudly. It echoed through the square, rebounding from stone walls, carrying a hollow note no metal should have made. The blacksmith who swung it stepped back immediately, shaking his arm as though the blow had jarred something deep inside his bones. But the lock gave way, shattered clean. The envoy nodded, and the workmen pushed against the door. It did not move. They pressed again. 6 men, shoulders braced, boots digging into frozen ground. The oak shuddered, groaned against its frame, but it would not open. It was as though the wood itself had fused with the stone. The envoy barked orders. Timbers were wedged, iron bars hammered into place. The men heaved, cursed, drove themselves red in the face. Nothing, and that was when one of them heard it. A sound, faint and low, from somewhere within the sealed church, like air shifting, like fabric drawn across stone, a whisper with no words. He pulled back immediately, refusing to go near the door again. The others laughed at him, but their laughter was forced, brittle. None stepped closer either. It took hours. Iron bent, wood splintered, sweat ran down brows despite the winter air, until finally, with a crack like bone snapping, the door lurched. A gasp spread across the square. Every villager took a step back. The hinges screamed. The workmen shoved one final time, and the church opened. The envoy stepped inside first. The villagers watched him cross the threshold, his torchlight spilling over the floor, and their faces changed. Every expression shifted from relief to something else, something colder, because the interior was not what it should have been. The air should have been foul with rot, the floor thick with dust, cobwebs lacing the rafters, pews warped with damp. But instead, the church looked untouched. The wood gleamed. The air was clear. No mold, no dust, no sign that decades had passed since its doors last opened. It was pristine, too pristine. The envoy's footsteps echoed sharply, each one unnatural in its clarity. He walked between the rows of pews, torchlight sweeping across their surfaces. And then he saw them. Books. Every prayer book in the parish. Not closed, not scattered, but open. Each one laid carefully across the pews, all open to the same page. The envoy froze. The workmen stared from the doorway, whispering among themselves. The villagers outside strained to glimpse what he had found. But something wasn't right. The air was too still, too calm, like a room holding its breath. The envoy lifted one of the books. His eyes scanned the text, and he went pale. He placed it down again, slowly, as though setting it upon an altar. The workmen refused to enter. Not one crossed the threshold. They muttered about the weight of the door, about the unnatural way it had resisted them. They muttered about the sound one of them swore he had heard inside. The villagers turned away, murmuring prayers, refusing to watch any longer. Mothers pulled children back from the edge of the square. Old men shuffled quickly into their homes. The envoy remained alone, standing in a church that should have been dust and ruin, but was instead perfect, preserved. And yet, Every book opened to the same line, a line no one ever repeated, not in their letters, not in their reports, not even in the bishop's archive. It was written down once, a note in the envoy's hand. But when archivists searched for it later, the page was missing, torn clean from the record. What remained was a description, one phrase only. He wrote, "They were waiting," and nothing more. The church was sealed again soon after. The envoy left without explanation. The workmen told stories in taverns, but never the same way twice. And the villagers, they simply stopped speaking of it. But silence never meant peace, because every time the wind passed through the square, it carried a sound not quite its own, like pages turning, pages no hand had touched, and always to the same place, the same line, open, waiting, for the day someone would read it aloud. The camera drifts across an empty square, stone worn flat where feet once gathered. The parish looms in the distance, its doors close again. A stillness rests over the village, not the silence of dawn or snow, but the silence after something has been taken away. The bishop's envoy had ordered it opened. He had stood in the square, robes pulled close against the cold, and watched as the workmen forced the lock. He had written letters describing what they found inside. He had promised the matter would be studied further. Weeks later, he was dead. His passing was explained as sudden illness, a fever, a decline of the body. But those who had seen him in his final hours whispered something different, that his lips kept moving even when his voice was gone, that he lay in his bed, eyes wide, staring at the ceiling beams above him, and though he made no sound, his mouth shaped words as if continuing a prayer, or finishing one, and then he stopped breathing. The workmen who had helped him that day were expected to return. Their wages were waiting at the local inn, their names written in the register, but they never collected them. One by one, villagers realized they had not seen the men leave. They had simply disappeared. A stable boy claimed their tools were still stacked against the wall. A cart driver said the horses they had borrowed were found untethered, grazing near the wood line, and the blacksmith swore he saw their coats hanging over the bench by the forge. But the men themselves were gone. The parish stood shut once again, sealed. The villagers gathered in the square and stared at it, waiting for someone to speak. No one did. At first they assumed the doors had been fastened again by another lock, but when they stepped closer, they saw no chains, no bars, no nails driven through the hinges. The doors simply did not open. Even the blacksmith, who pressed his shoulder to the wood and shoved with all his weight, could not make them budge. The miller tied a rope to the handle and fixed it to his horse, urging the beast forward until its hooves tore the dirt. Still nothing. The doors remained as if carved from the same stone as the church itself, seamless, unyielding, and so the villagers stepped back and waited, but something wasn't right. That night, no bell was heard. Not one. In the tavern, a farmer whispered that the bishop's envoy had not died of sickness. He had died because he looked too long at the page the books were left open to. Another man swore that one of the workmen had been seen walking into the woods at dusk, alone, carrying no lantern, leaving no footprints. Rumors spread quickly, but when the diocese was written to again, no response came. The matter was not pursued. The envoy's death was not investigated, and in the margins of diocesan records, the very edges of the parchment where scribes sometimes left notes to themselves, there appear brief fragments. One reads, "They went inside. They came out, but were not the same." Another, written in a different hand, simply says, "Best left sealed." The official annals contain no mention of the breach, no line acknowledging the doors were ever forced open, no record that the interior had been touched. It is as if the event was deliberately erased. The only trace lies in those scattered rumors, the envoy's silent lips, the vanished men, the doors that closed without a hand. The parish was left once again to the weeds and the weather, a building that stood but did not breathe, a space that seemed both present and absent, waiting. And though the villagers tried not to speak of it, some claimed that if you stood near the threshold at night, the wood seemed warm, as if heat still flickered behind it, as if candles still burned on the altar, but none dared to knock. None dared call inside, because by then everyone understood. The parish had chosen silence again, and silence was its answer to anyone who asked. Yet there was one question it had not answered. If nothing had been inside when the doors first opened, would it close them? The camera lingers on the parish walls, stone mottled with lichen, windows blind with dust. It feels abandoned, and yet watched. Years after the second silence, something new surfaced, not from the church itself, but from the curate's old quarters beside it, a journal. It was found in a chest of hymnals, wrapped in cloth, as if hidden, not preserved for record, but concealed. Its pages were yellowed, edges warped by damp. The leather spine cracked like dry skin. At first, it seemed ordinary. Notes of service, lists of names, collections for the poor. But then, the writing changed. The curate had begun to record more than numbers. He wrote of thoughts, of impressions, of things he claimed to hear. He described how the congregation gathered in dwindling numbers, how their voices faltered during hymns, how they looked to him, not for scripture, but for an answer, and he believed he had found one. The sermon began as most others did, with scripture, with familiar verses about stillness, about God's presence in the quiet. But soon the entries darkened. He wrote that true communion was not found in words, not in chanting, not even in the reading of the text. It was in silence, and silence alone. He told his parishioners that words were a barrier, that their songs were a distraction, that even prayer was a kind of noise keeping them from hearing the divine. He urged them to stop speaking, to stop singing, to sit in the dark of the nave, and listen. The journal describes their confusion, how the older women crossed themselves, how the children fidgeted, how the men shifted uneasily on the wooden pews. But the curate pressed them. He wrote that God was already present, that he was waiting, and that in silence he would answer them directly. It was no longer a sermon. It was an instruction. The handwriting begins to change. The neat script of a parish record becomes uneven. Letters slant, lines tremble. Ink bleeds as if pressed too hard into the page. The curate describes a congregation sitting in absolute stillness, minutes stretching to hours, no one moving, no one daring to breathe too loud. He wrote that the air grew heavy, that he could feel something pressing close, not seen but known, as if the silence itself had thickened, filling every corner of the nave. But something wasn't right. The journal notes that even after dismissal, many did not leave. They lingered in their pews long after the candles burned out, eyes fixed forward, waiting. The curate stopped recording scripture passages. He stopped marking collections. Every entry became about the silence. He claimed it had shape, that it had weight, that it was drawing nearer. And then one final passage. The date is marked carefully, the handwriting more frantic than before. He writes of a sermon given at midnight. He says the bells did not ring, yet the people came, as if summoned, every bench filled, no voice raised, only eyes on him. He describes stepping to the pulpit. He describes raising his hand. And he describes saying only one thing: this is the last word. The rest, he writes, would be silence, and in silence they would hear. The ink trails at this point. A few letters scratched, then broken, a mark like the pen slipping from his grip, and then nothing. No more entries follow. The journal ends there. The pen was never lifted again. What became of the curate after that night is not written. What happened to congregation is not recorded, only the blankness of the page, and the silence that follows it. Some believe he set down the book in the middle of his final sentence, that he heard something, that he turned, and never returned to finish it. Others believe the silence answered him, and that the last word he wrote was not his own, moss spreading across walls that no longer hold a roof. The ruins of the parish stand open to the sky. The bell tower snapped in half like bone left out to rot. The air hangs heavy here, as though even the wind avoids disturbing the silence. And yet, silence was exactly what they came for. A group of three, young, restless, explorers with cameras and audio recorders, carrying not only curiosity, but the expectation of spectacle. They had read fragments of diocesan notes, the whispered rumors about the doors sealing themselves, about villagers who refused to walk past the church after dark, and it was silence that drew them inside. They expected dust, decay, a ruin that had collapsed inward on itself. But the parish interior resisted that expectation. Though the roof had caved in long ago, the main floor was unervingly clear. Stones lay where they had fallen, yes, but the pews remained upright. A pattern of emptiness sat over everything, as if nothing had touched this place since the day the parish had closed. The explorers paused, and one of them whispered, not to the camera, not to the others, but to himself, "It feels wrong to speak in here." The words echoed faintly, vanishing into stone. But something wasn't right. The audio recorder was switched on. Its tiny red light blinked as though alive, pulsing gently with each second. They walked the nave, their footsteps crunching on stray gravel. The pulpit leaned to one side, weather-worn but still standing. The altar was intact, a white cloth eaten away by mold but still draped across its surface. And scattered along the pews, prayer books, each one warped by damp, but not destroyed. Each one open to the same page. They didn't notice it at first. It was only after one of them lifted a book carefully with both hands that he saw the text. The same hymn, the same prayer. And when he picked up another, it was the same again. Different bindings, different years of printing. Every single one open to the exact same line. But he didn't mention it aloud. Not then, because the silence pressed against him, and to speak of it felt like breaking something that shouldn't be broken. The group spread out. One placed a recorder near the altar. Another set one against the cracked wall at the rear. The third held his in his hand, letting it capture every step. The plan was simple: to leave the recorders running for hours, then return the next morning to collect them, to see if silence itself would reveal something only machines could hear. They left the church at dusk, and that night, the recorders waited in the dark. Hours passed. Wind rattled through broken windows. Small animals scurried in the grass outside, but inside, silence. When they returned at dawn, nothing seemed different. The recorders blinked as though nothing unusual had been captured. They packed them up, barely speaking, still reluctant to break the strange weight that hung over the parish. It wasn't until they played them back later that they noticed it. At first, the recordings matched what they expected. A low hum of static, occasional movement, long stretches of nothing. But after the first hour, the silence deepened. Not just silence, an emptiness, as though the microphone wasn't capturing air anymore. And under that emptiness, faint, almost imperceptible, something began to move. It was one of them who noticed it first. He lifted his headphones, frowning. "Do you hear that?" The others leaned in. At the very edge of the static, a sound, soft, repeating, the cadence of voices, but not speech, not conversation. Prayer, dozens of voices layered together, whispering in unison. The words were indistinct at first, but the rhythm was unmistakable. A litany, a recitation, the sound of a congregation speaking as one. The explorers froze, because they had walked through that church for hours, and they had been alone. They replayed the segment again. Headphones pressed tight, bodies leaned forward, hearts beating too fast. The whispers grew sharper the more they listened. Words formed, familiar words. "Our Father, who art in heaven," the Lord's Prayer, softer than breath, yet steady, unbroken, unified. The explorers sat motionless, each clinging to the headphones, waiting. The voices continued, verse after verse, until the prayer neared its end. And then it shifted. At the final line, when the word should have been closure, the voices collapsed, not into silence, but into a cry, raw, piercing, a sound of anguish, of terror breaking loose. Not one voice, but dozens, screaming in unison, as though the entire parish had turned their prayer into a final act of despair. The explorers ripped the headphones off. The sound continued to echo in their minds. None of them spoke for a long time. When they pressed play again, the recording had returned to silence. The cry was gone, as though it had never been there. But they had heard it. Each of them knew. The recorders captured hours more of silence, punctuated only by faint whispers. Each time, the prayer ended in the same way, a collective collapse, a cry that cut through the static like a blade. They replayed it again and again, and each time, the voices seemed louder, closer, as though, with each listening, the distance between the recording and the room itself grew smaller. And that's when he heard it, not in the headphones, but in the room around him, the faintest echo of whispered prayer, as though something had followed them home. The explorers never returned to the parish. The recording circulated quietly, passed between friends, analyzed in private, but official archives never mentioned them. The diocese kept no record. The whispers became rumor. The cries became myth. And yet, the audio still exists. Somewhere on a hard drive, on a forgotten tape. Hours of silence, broken only by prayer, and always ending in a cry. Because what they captured was not absence. It was presence. A congregation still speaking. Not in life, but in silence, under frost. That is how the parish remains. A husk of stone pressed flat against the winter hillside, locked behind fencing that rusts quietly year after year. To an outsider, it looks like nothing more than a ruin waiting to collapse. But the villagers know better, and they have been told to forget. The local maps do not mark it. Regional records list the site as demolished decades ago. And when questioned, officials insist that no such parish was ever registered here. But the fence is real. The lock gate is real. And at the center of that gate, bolted to steel, a plaque still hangs. Private property, no entry. It has no owner's name, no diocesan claim, no contact information, just a warning. The villagers call it the Hollow Church, because when you stand at the edge of the field, looking through the fence, it feels as though the parish pulls sound away. The closer you walk toward it, the more the world behind you disappears. The hum of insects fades. The breeze falls still. Even the crunch of your own boots becomes thin, fragile, as though the earth refuses to echo you. And yet, that silence has not stopped people from trying. The last attempt to trespass came in the late 1990s. A small group of students from the city, lured by whispers of a building that should not exist. They carried lanterns and crowbars. Villagers watched them cross the fence at dusk. They did not come back. In the morning, the gate stood locked again. The lanterns lay on the wrong side of the fence, abandoned, their glass unbroken. Their names remain unspoken here. But the villagers know. Because on certain nights, when the air turns sharp, when frost crawls over window glass and the fields fall rigid beneath moonlight, the silence ends. It begins faintly, like metal shifting. Then, all at once, a sound spills over the valley. The toll of a bell, deep, slow, relentless, always at midnight, and never more than once. But something wasn't right, because only a few hear it, not the whole village, not the curious wanderer or the passing motorist, only those who listen too closely. They describe it the same way. The sound doesn't come from the valley or the hills or the sky. It comes from inside their own chest, a vibration that moves through their bones before their ears. Some wake instantly at the stroke of midnight, pulled out of sleep by a pressure they cannot explain. Others freeze mid-step in the dark, sure they have imagined it, until they find their breath matching the rhythm of the bell. And the bell never echoes. It lands heavy and solitary, a sound with no reflection, as though the parish swallows its own voice. For years, those who claimed to hear it were dismissed. Old men with fading hearing, children with wild imaginations, farmers half drunk on winter ale. But the stories did not stop. And then one woman, a schoolteacher, tried to prove it. She set her alarm for 11:55. She woke, sat upright in bed, and waited. The night outside was clear. Her husband lay beside her, asleep. She closed her eyes, stilled her breathing, and focused on the silence. And at exactly 12, the bell struck. One deep, unbroken note. She sat frozen, her hands gripping the blanket. Her husband never moved. In the morning, when she told him, he shook his head. He had slept soundly, but she knew, because for the rest of that day, her ears rang with an aftertone, like metal pressed against the inside of her skull. She tried again the next night, and again the night after that. Each time, she heard it. Each time, he did not. And then one night she pressed a recorder to her chest, binding it in place with cloth, determined to capture what no one believed. She heard it, but the tape played back silence. She never tried again, because in the weeks that followed, she began waking not at midnight, but at 11, then at 10, then at 9, and always to silence. Yet within that silence, she swore she felt something moving, as though the bell was waiting to sound. Others in the village tell their own fragments. A farmer returned from the fields after dusk, hearing the toll so strongly that his knees gave way. A boy standing at the edge of the fence, shivering as the gate trembled with invisible weight. An old woman who claimed the sound was not a bell at all, but the iron bar of the gate slamming shut again and again. The details shift, but the pattern holds. Midnight, silence, and then the toll. Officials deny this, of course. The parish is sealed, monitored. The bells, they argue, were removed long ago. There is nothing left to ring. But no one has been allowed inside to confirm it. Not the press, not the villagers, no one. And yet, the stories grow darker, because sometimes the toll does not end with one. Sometimes it repeats, 2, 3, each louder than the last, until the listener feels the pressure break against their ribs, as though the sound is no longer outside but inside them, pushing upward through their lungs. One man claims it drove him to his knees in the snow, gasping, unable to draw breath until the toll ended. Another refuses to live within earshot anymore, moving his family across the valley. He will not speak of what he heard, only that it was not the bell that frightened him. It was what followed, because beneath the toll, so faint that only silence could hold it, he swore he heard the low drone of voices, as though the parish, long sealed, long forgotten, was still filled with those who prayed. And that's when he realized the bell did not mark midnight. It summoned it. The villagers have tried to protect themselves. Curtains are drawn early, windows bolted shut. Families pray at dusk, not at midnight, refusing to open themselves to what waits. But not everyone listens. There are always those who are drawn closer, those who believe they can stand at the fence and survive it. One winter, a group of boys dared each other to do it. They climbed to the edge of the field, huddled together against the cold, and waited for midnight. Only 2 came back. The third was found in the morning, collapsed against the fence, eyes wide open, frost woven through his lashes. The cause was listed as hypothermia, but the villagers knew, because when they lifted his body, the snow beneath was melted, and in the ice that remained, the faint curve of a bell was imprinted into the earth. The parish still stands, silent in daylight, silent in history, silent in every official record. But the villagers swear that on cold nights, when the air itself feels brittle, when the sky hangs low and the fields fall still, the bell tolls again, always at midnight, always once, and only for those who should not have listened, because what marks the hour is not a bell at all. It is a reminder that silence can be broken, and when it is, it does not let you go. Faith turned inward becomes silence. Silence when worship becomes hunger.